Let's say we go back further in history. What is your understanding of the historical examples of when ballot initiatives have come up in California that directly affect the rights of gays and lesbians?
Okay, there have been a number. Probably, most notably, was Proposition 6 in 1978, which was also known as the Briggs Initiative. This measure, by its terms, would have allowed public schools to fire teachers, teachers' aides, school administrators, or counselors found to be advocating, imposing, encouraging, or promoting homosexual activity or publicly or indiscreetly engaging in said acts as publicly and indiscreetly engaging in said acts.
And what was the vote on that measure?
Okay, so there was a contested campaign. After the election, there was a successful mobilization against Proposition 6, and the vote was decisive. It was 58% no on Proposition 6.
In the 1980s, which ballot measures, if any, directly affected the rights of gays and lesbians?
So there were three measures that were directly affected people infected by HIV virus. And the first one was Proposition 64 in 1986. A follow-up measure was Proposition 69 in 1988. Both of these measures, I think they were put on the ballot by Lyndon LaRouche, sought to make persons with HIV subject to quarantine and isolation. The voters decisively rejected both of those measures. The first vote in 1986 was 71% no vote. The second vote was a 68% no vote.
All right. And more recently, what efforts, if any, have there been with respect to California's domestic partnerships in terms of initiatives that might pertain to those?
I should say, before I talk about domestic partnerships, there was another ballot measure in the 1980s. That was Proposition 102, which would have required doctors of blood banks and other persons to report persons suspected of having the HIV virus. So this was, again, seen as being discriminatory against persons with HIV, and especially by the gay community. And the voters rejected that measure by, again, a large 65.6% vote. And so just to summarize the initiatives, those are the only three other ones in California that have been on the ballot that directly affect LGBT persons. And the California voters have rejected decisively all those three measures.
Now, what examples, if any, can you provide of measures that would have directly affected the rights of gays and lesbians but never made it to the ballot?
Okay, I describe there was success in the legislature by the LGBT community in attaining domestic partnership laws, and there were conservatives in the public who certainly opposed that legislation. And there was the potential, certainly, if the public, if the conservatives thought that the public would support either repeal through the popular referendum process or initiative to repeal those domestic partnership benefits, that they could have gone to the ballot and done that. But there was no ballot measure to repeal domestic partnership benefits in California.
All right. Now, I'd like to switch gears and ask you some more questions about developments in other states. What is the status of hate crimes legislation in the United States today?
So at the state level, there have been 30 states that have adopted hate crime legislation. That's setting aside the recent federal legislation. But at the state level, there's independently 30 states that have adopted the state-level hate crime legislation.
What is the status of employment discrimination prohibitions on the basis of sexual orientation?
Okay, this is an area where you have to look at both the state level and also the local level. At the state level, 21 states have adopted, across the board, employment protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in employment. Now, another 9 states have adopted, in addition to the 22, another 9 states have adopted protections against sexual orientation discrimination in public employment. And then, in addition to those states, there have been, at the local level, many city and county governments that have adopted non-discrimination laws as well.
Now, are those inside or outside of the 21 states that have statewide prohibitions?
In addition to the 21 states with the statewide prohibitions, these are outside. And that's 75 additional states. Additional local governments in those states without statewide laws in this area have adopted local ordinances to that effect.
To what extent, if any, are there legally enforceable contractual guarantees against employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation?
Okay, as I mentioned, many major corporations, as part of their employment policies and practices, have employee handbooks where they prohibit discrimination in employment on the basis of sexual orientation. And in many states, there are enforcement provisions that require those employee-based protections be enforced, those contractual protections be enforced in court.
All right. And what is the status of state employee domestic partnership benefits?
So according to a survey by the Human Rights Campaign, over 20 states have adopted state employee domestic partnership benefits at this point.
In recent years, how have openly gay politicians fared at the ballot box?
This is another example where I see sort of a trajectory of increasing success and power by the LGBT rights movement. There is an organization called the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund, which monitors these things. Not only keeps track of how many gay and lesbian, openly gay and lesbian candidates are running for office, but also promotes their candidacies. In 2008, that organization reported that 80 out of 111 openly LGBT candidates were elected to office. And last year, this was at the time the report was issued, at least 49 out of 79 openly LGBT candidates were elected to office.
And what prominent examples of openly gay and lesbian individuals being elected to office can you provide?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This is outside the scope of his expert report. It's also information that he did not know at the time of his deposition. I mean, at the time of his deposition, he didn't know what the anti-discrimination law were in any of these states. He didn't know how many people had been elected. He didn't know who had been elected. He didn't know any of this information that he's now reading off these charts. So I think that's it's objectionable on the grounds that it's not part of his report. And under Rules 26, I think it's not admissible.
Your Honor, I would respond by saying certainly we would cheerfully stipulate that he didn't know the election results in 2009. I asked Professor Segura about the 2009 election results, and I think to have the most recent information that Professor Segura has already testified to is relevant. And in addition, I reject the characterization that he did not have any opinions about the extensiveness of these laws.
Your Honor, I'm not talking about the 2009 laws. I'm talking about the laws that existed at the time his deposition was taken. The anti-discrimination laws. He didn't know what they were. He didn't know what states had them. He didn't know whether they protected gays, lesbian people, as well as other minorities. This is all stuff that he's developed.
Is this not a matter that you can take up on cross-examination?
Yeah, well, it is, Your Honor, it is. But on the other hand, we've had a lot of objections about Rule 26, and I do think this goes beyond the scope. But, yeah, I agree. I could take it up on cross.
All right, very well. Proceed, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, let's shift gears and talk about developments at the national level. How did you respond to Professor Segura's argument that gays and lesbians are politically powerless at the national level?
In my view, that's an incorrect assessment. I believe that gays and lesbians do have power at the national level.
And please describe recent events in Congress that pertain to your opinion.
So one important event would be the passage in Congress this last year of the Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Act. That's something that has been a priority of the LGBT community for some time. And this was enacted over some strong opposition in Congress by the Congress this past year. And to me, that's a demonstration of political power by the LGBT community.
All right. And what other legislation, if any, would you point to that reflects political power of the LGBT community?
Okay, so again, what I'm describing is what I would call and consider to be upward trajectory of power in these areas. So a number of priorities for the LGBT community is to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell restriction on military service, to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, and there have been the Employment Non-Discrimination Act as well as another important priority. And in each of these areas, there have been increased congressional support for these legislative objectives. And so if you look at, beginning with the Hate Crimes Act, that was legislation that was adopted this past year. The Domestic Partnership and Benefits and Obligations Act of 2009 is another important one as well. So in each of these cases, there has been increasing co-sponsorships. The legislation is moving In addition, you've got commitments from the leadership of Congress to move forward in these areas and from the President of the United States to support them. So on these top priorities of the LGBT community, there's evidence that there is increasing political power by that community.
Well, let's focus on President Obama. What, if anything, has President Obama done in response to the political goals sought by gays and lesbians?
So the first important act he did in this area was to sign the Matthew Shepard bill. There's a major signing ceremony at the White House. He also appointed openly gay and lesbian members of his administration. He, two important positions. He has had a major address of the Human Rights Campaign this past year. He again asserted his support for the LGBT community, made some commitments about his willingness to support their political objectives, and his commitment to, for example, don't ask, don't tell during his administration. So these are a few. These are just a few. I mean, some other ones are proclaiming Gay Pride Month. So in his first year in office, the president has even given evidence of support for the LGBT community. Now, I understand that some members of the community are, that they don't believe that he has given as much support as they think he should, but I think an objective standard, we would have to say that the president has given significant support for the LGBT rights movement.
And what is your opinion about the level of support that Speaker Nancy Pelosi has extended to the LGBT rights movement?
Again, I would say that she is an ally of the movement. She has consistently supported legislation to protect the rights of LGBT persons. And the passage of the Matthew Shepard Act was another example of the Speaker being able to move the bill through the House of Representatives.
Okay. Now, I would like to switch gears and ask you about trends and trajectories of political power. In the aftermath of Proposition 8, what was the reaction of some of the leading same-sex marriage advocates in California to the trends in public opinion in this area?
Okay, so obviously the proponents of same-sex marriage were highly disappointed by the outcome of Proposition 8, but there were some in the movement who said we have to step back a little bit and look at the progress that we've made. And one of them was Senator Mark Leno. In an interview, Senator Leno said, quote, "We picked up 18 points of support for marriage equality on November 4th. Proponents of Proposition 8 lost 18 points of support. The identical 14 words that were on Proposition 8 were on the ballot in Proposition 22 in 2000. We lost by 22 points in 2000. So in just 8 years, we've turned the dial so that we lost by just 4 percentage points. Our success is in that 18 points, and they're never getting that back. It's only moving in the right direction. What an uncommon phenomenon to be battling this war and to know without a doubt or debate that we will win."
Now, please describe trends in public opinion relating to support for the political goals of gays and lesbians.
To put it in general terms, I would say that the public has demonstrated increasing support for political objectives of LGBT persons. That can be measured in a number of different ways with respect to legal recognition of same-sex relationships, for employment, non-discrimination. On a wide range of issues, the polling data indicates increasing public support for non-discrimination and for protection of the rights and interests of LGBT persons.
And what has the Policy Institute of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Foundation found in this regard?
Okay, this was their analysis of the American National Election Studies data in 2000. Now this is, again, a major LGBT rights organization. And in a report analyzing the National Election Studies data, that organization found that, quote, "public attitudes toward 3 key gay and lesbian rights issues have undergone a striking liberalization over the past decade. Public support for adoption rights, the rights of gays and lesbians to serve in the military, and sexual orientation non-discrimination laws has increased substantially." And that was in 2000, and there is no evidence that that trend has diminished over time.
We've talked today about political power. What is your definition of political powerlessness?
So this definition is drawn from the Supreme Court's decision in Claiborne from 1985. And by that definition, political powerlessness indicates no ability to attract the attention of the lawmakers.
What is your opinion about the appropriateness of the Supreme Court's use of that test?
Yes, Mr. Boies, sustained.
What is your bottom line conclusion about whether gays and lesbians have the ability to attract attention of lawmakers in California?
Well, in my view, the evidence that we've just gone through and discussed indicates that gays and lesbians have the ability to attract the attention of lawmakers in California.
And what is your bottom line conclusion as to whether gays and lesbians have the ability to attract attention of lawmakers nationally at the federal level?
Again, surveying the evidence, it is my opinion that gays and lesbians have the ability to attract the attention of lawmakers at the federal level as well.
Your Honor, no further questions.
Very well. Mr. Boies, you may cross-examine.
Thank you, Your Honor. And as has become our custom, we are going to hand out some binders.
I see.
Good afternoon, Professor Miller, and it is now afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, you identified earlier in your examination a number of what you referred to as allies of the gay and lesbian community. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Now, are all of those individuals and organizations and groups that you identified allies of the African American rights?
Well, I can't think of anyone that are not, put it that way.
Well, we've got the Democratic Party and organized labor, elected officers, large corporations, newspapers, celebrities, churches, faith-based organizations, and professionals. Those are all allies.
I would say that all of those organizations would support rights for African Americans, yes.
And would they support rights for women, right?
That's correct.
And would support rights for racial minorities other than African American, correct?
That's correct.
And would support rights for Native American, correct?
That's correct.
Now, despite all those allies, Proposition 8 did pass, correct?
Yes, it passed.
Yeah. Now, do you have an opinion as to whether if the California legislature and the California governor were able to do so, would they have enacted legislation that permitted gay and lesbian marriage?
Well, the legislature voted to that effect, and so my view is that most likely they would have done it if they had the constitutional ability to do so. I mean, the governor has indicated that he supports same-sex marriage, so under those circumstances, it would seem so. But again, it's somewhat a hypothetical because we don't actually know. We were operating under one set of rules and would have to speculate a little bit as to what the outcome would be if it were not for Prop 22.
Yes, and it may be because of that you don't have an opinion on the issue. But what I'm doing is this. I'm asking you, as somebody who has been brought into this court as an expert by the defendants, whether you have an opinion as to whether, in the absence of Proposition 8 and the absence of Proposition 22, there would be legal gay and lesbian marriage in California today.
I think it's easier to answer for the legislature than for the governor. I think for the legislature, it's pretty clear that the legislature would. The legislature would enact gender-neutral marriage laws in California. For the governor, it's a little harder to say, but given his public statements in support of same-sex marriage, I think it's probably fair to say that, yes, he would have signed legislation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, is it fair to say that you've gotten a lot more information about this area than you had at the time your deposition was taken?
I've done further investigation of these matters in the past 6 weeks.
Well,
yes,
for example,
that's true.
at your deposition, you didn't know how many states had laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in employment, housing, public accommodations. Is that correct, sir?
Yeah, part of the problem in my answer to that question was I didn't know what the definition that the questioner was using, whether he was speaking about statewide legislation or whether that could include local legislation as well. As I indicated on my direct examination, there are many states that do not have statewide protections but have local municipalities and local governments that provide protection in those areas.
Uh-huh. Well, sir, let me direct your attention to page 197 of your deposition. which is at tab 1 of your binders.
I'm sorry, which tab is it?
It's tab 1.
I don't have tab 1. I've got binder 2 and 3.
Well, we will get you a tab 1.
Thank you. Okay, and which page is it?
Page 197, lines 18 through to 23. Question. I was asking about protection from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and to be more specific, I'll say in employment, housing, public accommodations. Answer. Okay, phrased that way, I haven't done an investigation and couldn't say. Did you give that testimony under oath, sir?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, for the rule of completeness, I would like to provide the context of the prior question and answer where he was asked on line 7. In how many states has the state legislature not enacted a law protecting gays and lesbians from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? And he answered, I would be surprised. Again, I'm not prepared to make conclusions on the legislation of all the 50 states, but given what I know about the advancement of things like adoption laws, domestic partnership laws, marriage in some states, I think it would be unlikely that there are more than half the states where there are no protections for gays and lesbians. But again, I would like to take a closer look.
And you had not taken that closer look at the time of your deposition, correct, sir?
That's correct.
And indeed, going back to the question and answer immediately before what your counsel just read, going back to line 22 on page 196. Question. In how many states is there no state law providing for protection from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? Answer. I think that was asked and answered, as I recall. Question. I may have forgotten your answer. You don't know the number? Answer. I don't know the number. Yeah.
I apologize. You're going to have to point me again to the line that we're at.
Line 22, page 196.
Okay.
Now, did you give that testimony under oath at your deposition, sir?
I wasn't following you, so I'm going to have to read it through again. I'm sorry.
Sure. Page 196, line 22.
Yes.
Do you have that?
Yes, I do.
All right. Question. In how many states is there no law providing protection from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? Answer. I think that was already asked and answered, as I recall. Question. I may have forgotten your answer. You don't know the number? Answer. I don't know the number. Yeah. Now, did you give that testimony under oath at your deposition?
That's my testimony.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
In my report, information about state-level protections of this type. Part of the problem was I wasn't sure about local non-discrimination laws.
Yes.
And so
And you didn't say that at your deposition, did you, sir?
No, I did not.
No. And again, as you do understand, I'm not focusing on what somebody wrote in your report or what was on those slides that you read. I'm focusing on what was in your mind at the time of your deposition. The answers you gave at the time of your deposition. You understand that's what I'm asking you about.
Yes, and what I wrote in my report is something I investigated myself.
Investigated yourself?
Yes, I did.
And you didn't go over it with counsel at all? Is that your testimony?
Not that part. I didn't discuss that part of my report with counsel.
Well, what parts did you discuss with counsel?
Objection, Your Honor. We have a stipulation in this case entered by the court indicating that communications between counsel and expert witnesses are not to be inquired into. And this line of questions is violative of the court's order.
Your Honor, he opened the door. He was the one who said I investigated it myself. He's the one that made the assertion that this was all his work product. Now, in the absence of that, I would agree with counsel, but he can't have it both ways.
Well, Your Honor, he made the statement he had no communication whatsoever in response to a question by Mr. Boies, who had inferred that, oh, you're reading something someone else had written. So I think this is inconsistent with the stipulation.
I think that it's appropriate for counsel to object to communications that the witnesses had with counsel, but I do think that the witness has opened the door to the issue of what it is that he himself investigated and what it is that he did not personally investigate, and I believe this was the tenor of Mr. Boies' question.
It was exactly, Your Honor.
No objection to that, Your Honor.
I investigated everything that was in my report.
I beg your pardon, sir.
I investigated everything that was in my report.
Personally?
Personally.
Personally investigated it. For example, every statement in there is something you personally investigated. Is that true?
I believe that's true, yes.
Well, for example, in your rebuttal report, you cite a number of documents.
I don't have my rebuttal report in front of me.
Well, it's tab number 2.
Okay.
And at the end, you have an index of materials considered, correct, sir?
That's correct.
And some of these materials provided you by counsel, or did you find them all yourself?
Most of these I found by myself.
That's not my question, sir. Remember my question?
If you can repeat it to me.
Sure. Now, were all of these materials you found yourself, or were some of them provided you by counsel?
Some of them were provided for me by counsel. I found most of them myself.
Okay. Now, would you, on the index of materials considered...
I'm sorry?
On the index of materials considered,
Oh, yeah, I have it here.
would you just go down and they are numbered, right?
Yes, they are.
Now, so would you just go down and just circle the ones that you were, that you found yourself, that were not provided by counsel? Just circle the ones you found yourself. Circle the number.
Yes, I'm moving through this, but I'm having some difficulty with some of the ones. I can't recall if I found them or whether I was provided by counsel.
Well, just put a question mark by those.
Okay. Okay, I have looked through it.
Thank you very much. Your Honor, could counsel approach and we could both approach and just take a look at what has been marked? Let me just ask a clarifying question.
Yes.
Now, what does the, you say the numbers 161 through 172, you put question marks next to them, and then you draw a line down them. Can you explain what that means?
Yes. Well, most of the question marks I can't recall one way or the other whether I individually found that myself or whether I first received it from counsel. On those, I don't remember seeing anything that said, you know, Form 990 on it that I investigated myself, and so I put those as non-question marks. Those are things I did not find myself.
Okay, and I think that is clear, but just to be certain, where you've drawn the line around 233 and 237, that is meant to mean they are all question marks.
Yeah. You'll be seeing more of those as I was trying to move things along.
Sure. I think that's an easy way to do it. I think that's understandable. So, the 259 through 271 are question marks.
That should be 272.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Your Honor, at break, we'll mark that as deposition so the record is clear.
Oh, very well. They will be marked. Those pages is what? PX 794A? Would that
Yes.
be a fair
Yeah.
designation? PX 794A?
Now, sir, at the time of your deposition, you were not aware of how many of the 10 most populous states had no state laws protecting gays and lesbians from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Correct, sir?
I didn't know how many had statewide laws. No.
And when you say you didn't know how many had statewide laws, well, let me ask you to look at page 193.
Okay. A deposition?
On your deposition,
Okay.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And lines 17 through 21. Question. Of the 10 most populous states in the United States, how many have no state laws protecting gays and lesbians from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? I don't know the answer to that question. Did you give that testimony under oath at your deposition, sir?
Again.
Please begin with a yes or no, sir.
Well, that was my answer, yes. But again, there's some confusion as to what the term that I had some confusion as to what the term was that Mr. Goldman was using.
Did you ask him to clarify?
Well, I think we had a couple of back and forths about that, and I said that I thought there were some if we included adoption provisions, etc. And I wasn't quite clear as to what he was referring to. And I probably should have, in that at that moment of the deposition, gone back and asked for additional clarification. But at that point, I just said I didn't know.
Now, well, sir, you can look at the pages immediately preceding this if you want. Is there any point on page 193 or 192 or going back to 191 or 190 when you talk about adoptions? You talk about adoption on page 190, right? Let me read the question. Question 7 on 190. I understand that, but you just told me that there is no state in which there is no protection for gays and lesbians. And I'm asking you what you have in mind. Where are there no protection on the basis, no protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? No hate crime statutes for perceived sexual orientation. What protections are there that you have in mind? Answer. Well, it would include a wide range of things in terms of allowing same-sex couples to adopt, just sort of looking through the protections that are available in California on page 15 and 16. This is a long list. I recognize that California has broader protections than many states, but I can't say with certainty in response to your question that there is any state that has no equivalent to any of these protections. Now, you gave that testimony, correct, sir?
Yes, I did.
And then you were asked on page 193. Question. Of the 10 most populous states in the United States, how many have no state laws protecting gays and lesbians from discrimination against sexual orientation? And you said, I don't know the answer to that question. Now, there wasn't any issue about whether you were talking about statewide laws or not, correct?
Well, in the phrasing of the question, he doesn't say one way or the other.
And you don't ask him.
No.
No.
I probably should have.
Well, let me just make sure I have your testimony. If the question had been of the 10 most populous states of the United States, how many had no statewide laws protecting gays and lesbians from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, would you have an answer to that question?
I'm not sure that I would have had an answer to that question.
Okay.
On the top 10. But when we were talking about it, it's more than 20, less than 20, those kinds of things. That's where I had confusion as to how many states had protections against discrimination. I was thinking in terms of the local level as well as the statewide level.
And your answer here was that you didn't know the answer, correct?
To which question?
To either question. You didn't know the answer to either question. Any of those questions at your deposition, did you?
To the questions with respect to the top 10 states?
Yes.
I did not know.
Okay. Now, you've just gone through the materials you relied on, and none of those materials provide the information that is on demonstrative 33, correct?
I think that's incorrect.
Okay. Which of the materials that you relied on provide that? Employment discrimination prohibition is in 21 states. That employment discrimination prohibition is in 21 states and 75 localities in the remaining states that have protections.
The 21 states is information provided by the Human Rights Campaign.
And where is it in your list of things relied on? Which one is that?
Let me see if I can find it.
It's tab 2. Are you referring to number 195 or 196 or 194, each of which is a Human Rights Campaign?
I think I had it wrong. I meant the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force.
The National Gay and Lesbian Task Force is what you meant.
I'm trying to remember where I got that information about the 21 states. It's in my report. I mean, that was something I considered at the time. I could go back to the report if I had it here.
Well, your report is there. It's there. What I'm asking you is, where did you get the information?
It should be in the report. It's paragraph 99 of the report, and I was going through the Human Rights Campaign website, and there's a link to laws and elections, and that's where I found the information about the non-discrimination laws.
Yeah, and what it says here,
as well as other civil union laws, domestic partnership. These are grouped together on the Human Rights Campaign website. And so there's some confusion to me as to what we're talking about, because they have got these different maps of the United States with states coded by color as to whether they have particular protections for gays and lesbians.
And what did you do to try to resolve that confusion?
Well, I noted it in my report as clearly as I could, and breaking them out, I think I could read it for you in 99.
You don't have to read it. You don't have to read number 99. The question is, do you say in 99 that there's confusion?
No. No. I say 31 states and the District of Columbia have adopted laws punishing hate crimes. 21 states and the District of Columbia have adopted laws to prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation.
To move things along, it's not necessary to read it into the record.
Well, I'm just trying to be
My question,
responsive. Yes.
you said there was confusion. You recall that?
I was confused about the question because there's various different states that have various different laws with respect to protection on the basis of sexual orientation.
Well, let me try to put a question on that. Hopefully that will not be confusing. You recognize that in certain states with protection against discrimination against minorities, some of those states do not provide protection for gays and lesbians, or they provide narrower protection for gays and lesbians, correct?
I'm sorry, I thought there might be a double negative. Can you repeat that?
Sure. Well, maybe the best way is to direct your attention right to your deposition.
Okay.
Page 198, line 22. Question. Do you know whether in many places where laws prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, the protections are narrower than laws in the same jurisdiction that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race or sex? Answer. Can you define what you mean by narrower? Question. For example, they may cover fewer forums or arenas or potential discrimination. They may cover fewer actors. They may be subject to broader exceptions. Those would be some examples. Answer. So I haven't looked closely at other states to be able to form an opinion as to whether the protections for gays and lesbians in those states where there are available are narrower than for other minority groups. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And did you give that testimony under oath at your deposition?
Yes, I did.
Now, you talked about the extent to which gays and lesbians had been elected to office in your direct testimony. You remember that?
Yes.
Now, at your deposition, do you recall being asked whether or not lesbians and gays are underrepresented in elective office nationwide?
I believe I was asked that, yes.
And do you recall that you didn't know the answer at that time?
I remember that I didn't have a good answer to give because it's a difficult question, actually.
And do you have an answer for that today?
I can explain why it's a difficult question for me to
No,
answer.
I don't need you to explain why you don't have an answer. I'm simply trying to find out if you do have an answer.
I have an answer, yeah, I guess.
Are they underrepresented today?
My answer is I don't know, because it's difficult to figure up either the numerator or denominator if we're thinking about whether the group has what the ratio is between gays and lesbians in public office and gays and lesbians in the United States.
Well, sir, take California, all right? You know that no openly gay or lesbian person has ever, in the history of the state, been elected to statewide office, correct, sir?
No openly gay person, that's correct.
No, not governor, not lieutenant governor, not attorney general, not senator, correct, sir?
That's correct.
So in that case, whatever the denominator would be, the numerator would be 0, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, you talked about what you referred to as the upward trajectory of gays and lesbians. Actually, you referred to it as the LGBT community. Do you recall that?
In my testimony today?
Yes.
Yes.
In fact, throughout your testimony, you were referring to the LGBT community, correct?
That's correct.
Now, is that a term that you use at all that you used at all in your expert report?
I don't recall. I believe so.
You do believe so.
Yeah, but I would have to go back and look at it.
Well, maybe when we take a break, you can go back and see how many times, if at all, you use that term. Have you ever used that term in any of your academic writings?
Not in my writings.
Did you ever use
In my
that?
classes, I do.
Well, did you ever use that term in your deposition?
LGBT? I don't recall.
All right. Let me go back to the national level. You referred to don't ask, don't tell. You recall that?
Yes.
Yes. And gays and lesbians are still being discharged from the military under don't ask, don't tell. Correct?
Yes. I believe it's in lesser numbers, but it's still correct, yes.
Now, is there any other minority in the country that you can identify that is discharged from the military when they're doing a perfectly good job because somebody discovers their status?
I don't know how we would define minority in that case.
Well, in your testimony, you were talking about discrimination against minorities.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Right. So now, using minority the way you used it in your testimony, is there any other minority that is discharged from the military when they're doing a perfectly good job just because someone discovers their status?
I'd have to say that I'm not aware of any.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned the Defense of Marriage Act, remember?
Correct.
And the Defense of Marriage Act has not been repealed, correct?
That's correct.
And you would recognize that as a significant piece of legislation that is against the interests of the LGBT community, correct?
Yes. I would guess that the majority of LGBT community would support the repeal of DOMA, yes.
Now, indeed, you say you would guess that. As an expert,
Yes.
would it be your opinion that the majority of the LGBT community would like to see DOMA repealed?
Well, that's my opinion, yes.
Now, even though you may not be an expert in this area, you are aware that historically in this country, there has always been severe prejudice and discrimination against gays and lesbians, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And since you did begin studying this in the 1970s, you're aware that the discrimination had continued into the period that you've actually studied, correct, sir?
That's correct.
Now, you were asked at your deposition about the term gay bashing. You recall that?
Yes.
And you said you were familiar with the term, correct?
Yes.
What does it mean to you?
Most of the times when I've heard the term, it's been used to describe insults against gay and lesbian people. It can also be used to describe physical violence against gay and lesbian people.
Now, when did you come to realize that the term could be described or used to describe physical violence against gay and lesbian people?
I think that I've always known that it can be. I think it's more often than not, in my experience, used to describe insults than physical violence.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Very well.
Let me ask you to look at page 39 on your deposition, beginning on line 22. 22.
Yes.
All right? Question. Are you familiar with the term gay bashing? Answer. I've heard that term before, yes. Question. What is your understanding of the meaning of that term? Again, I don't know if this is a dictionary definition of the term, but my understanding would be I don't think it means physical violence against gays. I think it means pejorative statements, maybe, attacks against gays and lesbian persons. Question. Can it include physical violence as well? Answer. Again, it would seem it would, given the term. It seems like a bashing has a sense of violence to it, but I guess in the way I've heard it in conversation, it would be more used for sort of verbal attacks as opposed to physical attacks. Did you give that testimony under oath at your deposition, sir?
Yes, I did.
Now, at your deposition, you were asked questions about prejudice against gays and lesbians, correct?
Yes.
And you were asked these questions, and you gave these answers. Page 34, line 18.
Thank you.
Question. What academic books or articles are you familiar with that deal with prejudice against minority groups? Answer. I'm not thinking of titles that I can name for you. Yeah. Answer. No, I can't. No. Did you give that testimony at your deposition?
Yes, I did.
Now today you are familiar with some academic books or articles dealing with minority group prejudice, correct?
That's right.
And did that come from research that you did between your deposition and today?
No. I think I listed a number of these authors in my deposition, actually. I think I was interpreting that question narrowly to be a book specifically about prejudice. I think that there are lots of books that address the problem of prejudice without having that in the title, for example.
Well, the question said, what academic books or articles are you familiar with that deal with prejudice against minority groups, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. You believe that a law prohibiting same-sex sexual conduct, intimacy between gays and lesbians, a law prohibiting that, would that reflect prejudice against gays and lesbians?
Well, first of all, it's not a law that I would vote for. I would vote to repeal. I don't know what the law, the purpose of such a law would be. I can't think of any good basis for such a law. As for the definition of prejudice, we'd have to look at that more closely.
Well, your definition of prejudice was given in your deposition, right?
I gave a definition in the deposition,
Right.
yes.
And your definition of prejudice is an unfair judgment against an individual or group, correct?
That was a general definition that I offered, yes.
And that was your definition as a political scientist, correct?
I think it's consistent with generally how political scientists think about this problem.
Well, not only was it consistent with how generally political scientists would define it, but it was your definition, correct?
It was a definition I offered.
Yes. Now, using prejudice in that way, does a law that prohibits same-sex sexual conduct reflect prejudice against gays and lesbians as you use the term?
As being an unfair judgment? Again, I can't speak to what was in the minds of the lawmakers in that instance. I mean, there might have been a range of different reasons why they would enact that law, which could include moral disapproval of certain sexual activities. It could have had other bases. If there was no sort of supportable basis for that law, then I would think that it would be prejudice. But I would have to know what the basis of that lawmakers offered, what it was for that bill.
Well, so sitting here without any more context, you can't say, in your opinion, whether a law prohibiting sexual conduct between two people of the same sex would or would not constitute prejudice, correct?
Again, that's something that I wouldn't support, but I can't say whether it would constitute prejudice or not without knowing more.
Okay. You do recall that there was a time in this country where a number of states had those laws that criminalized homosexual activity, correct?
There are sodomy laws that criminalize sexual activity for both homosexuals and heterosexuals, and I know that those were there were still some of those laws in place before the Supreme Court struck them down.
And there were
Yes.
laws that simply prohibited homosexual activity and did not prohibit the exact same act performed by heterosexuals, correct? For states that had those laws.
I'm aware of at least one state, which was Texas. That's my understanding of the Texas statute.
And the reason you're familiar with Texas statute is what was involved in Lawrence v. Texas, correct?
Correct.
Now, at the time that Lawrence was decided, how many states had laws that would criminalize sexual conduct between homosexuals?
I don't know the exact number. I know it was declining after the Bowers versus Hardwick decision, but I don't know the exact number.
Well, does 25 states at the time of Bowers and 13 states at the time of Lawrence sound about right to you, sir?
Sounds approximately correct. Again, I don't know how many were covered both heterosexual and activity as well as only homosexual sexual activity.
But you know that all of those states criminalized homosexual activity, correct?
Well, some did for heterosexual as
Focus
well.
on my question, sir.
And yes, some did heterosexual as well.
I'm not focusing on heterosexual right now. I'm focusing on homosexual activities. All of those states prohibited homosexual activity and criminalized it, correct?
Yes, and some did for heterosexual activity as well.
Your Honor,
gave
can
the
I
answer
ask the
yes.
witness be...
Why don't you answer the question directly? Mr. Thompson can bring out any additional facts that he thinks is necessary in order to put this answer into context. Counsel is entitled to a direct answer to his question.
As I said 2 or 3 times, the answer is yes.
Now, gays and lesbians were barred from federal employment for a long time, correct?
Starting after World War II for some period of time, yes.
Your Honor, we are now going well beyond the scope of the witness's expertise. We haven't tendered him as an historical expert on the history of discrimination. This was covered by Professor Chauncey.
Your Honor, I think that objection has some merit to it.
Well, then I'll sustain it.
Sorry, it was just too hard for me to resist. All right, sir. Speaking of Professor Chauncey, have you read any books by Professor Chauncey?
No, I have not.
You know who Professor Chauncey is, do you not?
Not really, no. I know he has been a witness in this case, but I haven't read his work.
You know who Miriam Smith is?
No.
Have you ever read anything by Miriam Smith?
No, I have not.
Do you know who Shane Phelan is?
I do not recall that name, no.
Do you know who Ellen Regal is?
Again, I do not recall
Or
that
Barry
name.
Tadlock?
Same answer.
Are you familiar with a book entitled Gays and Lesbians in the Democratic Process? Public Policy, Public Opinion, and Political Representation.
I may have heard of that book, but I have not read that book.
Now, you mentioned Professor Eakskridge before. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And what books have you read by him?
I've read part of, I believe the name of the book is Gay Law by Professor Eskridge. I've also read his constitutional law casebook.
Anything else?
That book's all that I can recall.
You also mentioned Dr. Piniella.
Yes.
Do you recall that?
Yes.
What books have you read by him?
I can't recall the title of the book. He was one of the panel that I was on, and I remember reading some of his work at that point, but I can't remember the titles.
Well, was it a book or an article or a paper, or what was it?
What I read was a working paper.
Working paper.
Yeah.
So you've never read any article by him or any book by him?
I think I've read some articles by him, but I can't recall the titles.
Have you ever read any books by Mark Blasius? B-L-A-S-I-U-S.
No, I have not.
You know who he is?
No, he's a scholar, but I haven't read his work.
You know what he's a scholar in?
He, LGBT issues, I think, he's known for.
When did you discover that Professor Blasius was a scholar in this area?
This was after my deposition. This was a name I hadn't heard of, so after my deposition, I took a look.
Okay. Do you know who Uvrashi Vaid is?
She's not a scholar. I think she's in New York, does work in this area.
Have you ever read any of her work?
No, I've not.
When did you discover that she was a scholar in this area?
The same thing, after my deposition. That was a name that was mentioned, and I took a look.
You may have mentioned it in your deposition. You were asked about it, and you didn't know who it was, right? You didn't know who they were.
Well, I may have heard her name in the past, but I couldn't recall at the deposition.
Well, one name you did mention at your deposition was Andrew Sullivan. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
What books have you read by Mr. Sullivan?
A book that I've read and I've assigned to students is Same-Sex Marriage, Pro and Con, a Reader. I've read parts of Virtually Normal, but not the whole book.
Parts, but not the whole book.
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say that you read the entire book that you assign your students?
Yes.
Oh. And that's a collection of articles and pieces, correct?
Yeah. He writes, he's written some of the articles, and he's got a range of different writers who contribute to a robust discussion on this issue.
Well, he's also written books himself, correct?
Yes.
Have you read any of those books?
As I said, I've read part of Virtually Normal, but not the whole book.
And no parts of any other books?
By Andrew Sullivan?
Yes.
Not that I recall, no.
All right. I'm going to ask you about another person, and I'm going to spell his last name because I'm not sure I'll pronounce it right. It's Jon D'(E-M-I-L-I-O). You familiar who he is?
Yes, I am.
And he's a scholar in this area, correct?
That's correct.
Have you read his books?
No, I have not.
Do you know he's written books, correct?
Yes, I do. He's a well-known scholar in this area.
But you haven't read his books.
That's correct.
Have you read any articles by him?
I may have. I can't recall the titles.
Now, is it your opinion that one of the factors you would look in at determining the political power of a minority group is to the extent to which that minority group is experiencing discrimination?
I think that would be a factor I would look at, yes.
And have you looked at that for what you refer to as the LGBT community?
Yes, I have.
And are there examples of discrimination against gays and lesbians at the present time, within the last several years? Not going back into ancient history, but in the time that you say you're an expert in. Are there examples of discrimination against gays and lesbians?
So I think it's fair to say that the restricted ability to serve in the military could be described as discrimination against gays and lesbians, yes.
All right. Are there any other examples of discrimination against gays and lesbians that you refer to as the modern period?
That would certainly be the prominent one in terms of legally enforced discrimination, in my view, which is there could be private discrimination, which is I have no way of knowing how much private discrimination there is, but in terms of, like you mentioned, federal employment, there was a time when gays and lesbians were banned from federal employment. Now that's been repealed, and many other laws like that, which create official discrimination against gays and lesbians, has been repealed, whereas the military situation is different.
Now, I just want to be sure I understand what you're saying. You are saying that there is official discrimination like the don't ask, don't tell policy, correct? I mean, that's what you refer to as official discrimination.
It's legally enforced rules that have an effect on gays and lesbians, which is different than heterosexual people, yes.
Yeah, and that's what you refer to as official discrimination. Is that true? I'm just trying to get your words correct.
Maybe legal is a better word. Or de jure. I mean, I don't know how you want to describe it. Various different ways to describe the same thing.
Well, what is the word you use? Because I want to use your language.
Okay, official would be fine.
Okay, official. And by official discrimination, you mean discrimination that is legally enforced. Discrimination by the state, correct?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Now, are you aware of any of what you call official discrimination against gays and lesbians in this country today, other than the don't ask, don't tell policy?
I'm just trying to think of other laws or official policies that discriminate on that basis. Obviously, I think what you're looking at is, one thing would be the DOMA policy, right?
And there you go.
Okay, so... And I know that's what you're getting at,
yeah,
right?
Now that would be another example, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, now what are some other examples?
Well, I think the DOMA policy would be something where it's a question as to what the nature of the discrimination is. But there is a differential treatment between same-sex couples and heterosexual couples under that law.
Right, yes. Now, what are other examples of official discrimination that you are aware of?
I can't think of... at this time, any other de jure or official laws that discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation.
Now, are you aware now, and just so the question is clear, are you talking now at the federal level? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
All right, so let me shift then to the state level.
Okay.
At the state level, what official discrimination against gays and lesbians are you aware of?
Well, the military. I actually don't know how National Guard units work, if that's considered federal or state, so I would guess that there would be comparable restrictions in that area. In terms of other laws that would, officially discriminate at the state level against gays and lesbians, there might be an absence of non-discrimination laws. But in terms of the government officially discriminating itself on the basis of sexual orientation, again, if we're looking at the institution of marriage, then the state does treat heterosexual couples differently than same-sex couples.
Yes. And if you're looking at adoption, some states treat heterosexuals differently than homosexuals as well, correct?
That's a more complicated area of law. I think there's more discretion by individual judges. I think only a couple of states have statewide policies that actually restrict adoption. Now, Arkansas is an example where the restriction is on unmarried couples, so that could be either heterosexual or same-sex.
Yeah, but in Arkansas, they put that in at the same time they put in a law that said gay and lesbians couldn't marry, correct?
That's correct.
So it means that because gay and lesbians can't marry, by definition, they're not going to be married persons so they can't adopt, correct?
That fact is correct, but it also applies to heterosexual couples.
Well,
as
except heterosexual couples can marry, correct? In Arkansas,
well,
they can.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is a restriction on them that they would have to marry in order to adopt.
Right, and gays and lesbians can't marry, so they can't adopt, correct?
That's the current law.
Now, are you aware of discrimination against gays and lesbians today that does not fall into what you refer to as official discrimination?
In terms of private discrimination, it was. Is that what you're getting at?
But again, let me just make sure I understand what your words mean. Now, for you, private discrimination is any discrimination that is not codified into law, correct?
That's the distinction I was drawing out, yes.
Okay. Well, using private discrimination the way you use it, are you aware of any examples of private discrimination against gays and lesbians?
Well, I know that there's lots of cases that are brought against, for example, employers for sexual orientation discrimination, and there are avenues for pursuing anti-discrimination claims against employers. So obviously there are cases of private discrimination currently in the United States, and to some extent those are gay and lesbian people being discriminated on that basis can get redressed through administrative agencies or in the courts. So yes, I am aware that there is ongoing discrimination in the United States.
All right, and have you tried to investigate the extent of that at all?
Not private discrimination, no.
No.